So let's get comfortable, grab some popcorn, settle in, and let's get on with the show. So why are we here? What is economics? It's the study of how human beings coordinate their wants and desires. Of course, this coordination that takes place has certain constraints to it. It has to fit in within our social customs. It has to fit in with the political realities of where it is that we live. This is a decision-making mechanism. Economics helps us to arrive to get at our optimum choices so we can maximize our happiness. And because items are scarce, we've got to make decisions about how do we optimize our choices given that there are limits to everything, the scarcity. In other words, our economic wants exceed society's productive capacity. We all may want lots of bling, we all may want lots of cars, but we all know that these things are scarce. And it's the scarcity that creates value. The fact that we want all this, but only this amount exists, that's what creates the value. So to quote from the Jay Giles band, I want me a suit, I want me a car, I want me to look like a Hollywood star. It's normal human behavior to want these things, to want more than what we had, to better our standard of living. But we can't just snap our fingers and say, I want it, because items are scarce. And so we need to arrive at what is our optimum choice. And economics gets us there. No, it's a social science. It's not a physical science. We can't go into the laboratory and mix two chemicals and see the reaction, and we can't then go back the next day and mix the same two chemicals and see if we get the same reaction. We can't have those precisely controlled experiments. We have one laboratory. It's called our economy, and we can't hold it still. And so when we try to do our analyses, we're trying to isolate as many variables as we can, but we know that we can't, and there's just too many variables moving at the same time. But since we are dealing with people, and the decisions that people make, it's a social science. That's why we see that in some colleges, economics is under the umbrella of the sociology department. And in other colleges, we find economics under the umbrella of the business school. Because both are true. It is a social science, because it does involve people and the way people make decisions. But at the same time, it certainly has a big impact on how we run our businesses. So it's got one foot in each world. What do we study? We're really studying how people make decisions. How did you arrive at that Diet Coke that you're drinking? How did you arrive at that red sweater that you're wearing? How did you arrive at that particular pen that you're writing with? All these things are decisions, and you arrive at them in a certain way, and economists study how you did it. It's how people interact with each other, because we are constantly trading with each other. Sometimes we're trading dollars, sometimes we're trading actual objects, but we're trading, and so we're interacting, and so economists study that. And then economists study the various forces and trends that affect the economy as a whole. We're looking at, for example, how does a change in interest rates affect the entire economy? We break economics down into two groups, micro and macro. Microeconomics, we're studying individual markets. For example, what is the market for reading glasses? Or what is the market for cell phones? We're looking at individual goods and services. We're looking at how individuals are making decisions in those individual markets. We're looking at how individual firms are pricing their output in those markets. Whereas in macroeconomics, we're looking at the whole economy. We're looking at what is the inflation in the whole US? What is the gross national product of the United States? What is unemployment in the whole US? And so we're looking at the economy as a whole. So, for example, in micro, again, the pricing policy of firms. How does a monopolist arrive at his price, whereas how does a competitor firm arrive at his price? How are households making their decisions? How do markets allocate their resources? In other words, in the market for copper, how do we determine how much of the copper is going to make wire and how much of the copper is going to make, let's say, sheeting for decorative roofs? And when we study how markets behave, we can arrive at conclusions on how that copper will get allocated. Whereas in macro, we're looking at inflation, unemployment, economic growth. We also have economics broken up into two other categories, both positive and normative economics. Positive economics, straightforward. Inflation was 2% this past quarter. It's a statement of fact, it's verifiable, it's measurable, it's not controversial because everyone can take the measurements. Normative, this is where the controversy comes in, because this is where we're saying things like, inflation was 2% and that's too high and we need to get it lower. There's some value judgment there. Or 2% inflation is too low and we need to get it higher. Again, a value judgment has been placed upon and on top of the factual statement. So we have positive and normative. Many people get the feeling that economists don't agree with each other. And to an extent, particularly when we're talking the normative economics, where we put the value judgments, there's a bit of disagreement. But when we're looking at the positive statements, when we look at positive economics, when we're talking about things that we can measure, we find that there is great agreement among economists. And so the old joke about when you're asking an economist a question about the three-handed economist, where the answer is, well, on this hand, but on this hand, but on the other hand, okay, we don't see much of that when we're strictly limiting our conversation to the positive statements, the ones that are factual. So for example, the first one here, a ceiling on rent control, reduces the quantity and quality of housing. And 93% of economists agree. In other words, you ask most economists and they'll tell you rent control is a bad thing. Which is not to say that the intent and desire that implemented the rent control came from a bad place. It's simply saying that it wasn't a good way to achieve what you're trying to achieve. Tariffs and import quotas reduce general economic welfare, and again, overwhelmingly, economists agree that tariffs are a bad thing. We had the current president's chief economist resign when the president wanted to institute all these tariffs a little over a year or so ago, because said, I can't have my name associated with it. It's a bad thing to do. It's not good for the economy. It's not good for economic welfare. And he said, I can't have my name associated with that, and so he had resigned. Let's see, let me just pick out a couple here. Yeah, I like this one here. We should eliminate agricultural subsidies. This often gets a few eyebrows raised in my classes. One of my favorite examples is tobacco. We subsidize tobacco farming, and then we wind up with surplus tobacco, and then we pass laws restricting the consumption of tobacco. Like we put a tax on cigarettes to reduce the consumption. So we're paying subsidies to increase the production, and then we're putting a tax that people pay for to reduce it. It's just like canceling each other out. If the federal budget should be balanced, it should be done over a business cycle rather than over a year. And in macro, we will talk about why this is so. But it gives us more flexibility to have a balanced budget. Let's see. Yeah, here's one of our favorite ones, minimum wage. Minimum wage causes unemployment, and we will cover this in class later. The intent and desire behind minimum wage, I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing whether we should have a safety net. What we're saying here is minimum wage is the right way to do it. And if you ask economists, they're going to tell you minimum wage is not the right way because minimum wage kills jobs. It causes unemployment. And so we have all these things that economists do agree on. All right, let's go back to scarcity. It exists because people want more than what we are able to produce. Therefore, it's too few to satisfy. Now, let's take in a deep breath. Enjoy that breath of air. Not very scarce, is it? And so even though we need it to live, it's very valuable to us. It's not scarce, and therefore, what do we pay for it? On the other hand, let's say you want to go scuba diving, and you need a tank of air, and you're going to pay money for that, because that tank of air is not scarce the way the atmosphere is. That's a particular product that is in limited supply. It has value because of its limited supply, and so even though it's air, the fact that it is air in a different time, place, location, format, whatever you want, it's now scarce. And so scarcity is what creates the value. If we had someone go up in a rocket ship to a meteor And that meteor was filled with diamonds. And they brought all those diamonds right back to Earth. Diamonds wouldn't be scarce anymore, and the value of a diamond would plummet. And so the idea of going out to one of these meteors and mining it, we have to be careful as to how much we are putting into circulation. Scarcity is constantly changing. It can change for a number of reasons. One, it could change from advertising. With enough advertising to change your tastes, they might get you to want to buy things in ever increasing quantities that you didn't want before, and it can create scarcity different from what it was the day before. So advertising does it. Temperature does it. Your desire to have air conditioning changes as the temperature changes. In the morning, when it's, say, 75 degrees out, your desire for air conditioning is very little. But as the day goes on, you want more air conditioning, and so your demand for electricity goes up, and electricity becomes more scarce as the day goes on, and the price of electricity during the course of the day goes up. And at night, it comes back down. So the degree of scarcity is constantly changing due to many factors. And so we see that nothing is static. Things are constantly changing. The quantity of goods that are out there, the number of services that are available, our resources, whether it be, say, oil and gas, they're all dependent upon technology. If we come up with a new technology that allows us to drill for oil cheaper, faster than before, well, then the scarcity of oil changes. And, of course, human action. I am reminded of that the impact that our Instagram influencers have on scarcity, or Hollywood stars, or anyone, or say the red carpet when they always ask whose line of clothing are you wearing. And this human action is changing the amount that people want something, and if people's wants change, then the scarcity changes. Let's define opportunity cost. It's got a tough definition, a real mouthful. So I'm going to say it. I will skip to the next slide, which will help you go, aha, I get it, and then come back to this slide. So opportunity cost is the benefit foregone. It's the benefit that you gave up of your next best alternative when you've made a choice on something. It's the benefit foregone of the next best alternative to the activity that you've chosen. That's a mouthful. Let's move to the next slide and you'll get it. Opportunity cost, right? He stands in line for 45 minutes for a slice of free pizza. Was it free? No. He gave up 45 minutes of his time that he could have been doing something else. He could have been studying economics, for example, and there's a value to studying for, say, his next test. And by standing in line, he gave that up, right? So you had to give up something. When he made that decision to stand in line, he gave up something. In this case, he gave up his time. It's not always time that you're giving up. Sometimes you're giving up the allocation of resources. So let's get back to this. It's what you gave up, the benefit of what you gave up when you made a choice. Every single choice that you make has an opportunity cost associated with it that you gave up. It was foregone. If that gentleman stood in line for 45 minutes, when in his own mind was, I really need to study, then he made the wrong choice. In other words, whatever choice you make, opportunity cost should always be less than the choice that you made, that the benefits that you get from the choice you made should be greater than what you passed up on. Otherwise, you're not being rational. Okay? And so, as economists, we want you behaving rationally. We want you to, as we said, optimize your choices and your decision making. And so when we come up with this cost-benefit economic reasoning, this concept of opportunity cost forms the underlying basis. My little editorial comment here. In order to make rational life decisions, you need to understand the concept of opportunity cost. Because if you make decisions that aren't in accordance with factoring in opportunity costs, you will arrive at the wrong decisions. So, examples. You're here. You made a choice to be here. And in doing so, you made a choice that said, I am going to forego working right now. I could be out there working and making some money, but by being here, you can't be making some money. So the opportunity cost of your being here is that whatever the hour and 15 minutes that you're here, that you have decided not to earn income for that hour. Or the money that you spent on tuition and books, you could have used it to purchase something else that would give you a certain amount of pleasure, utility. On the other hand, In weighing whether you want to be here listening to my golden words, you are making a cost-benefit decision that I'm not just going to consider my opportunity costs of today, but also my opportunity costs down the road. The government has to always consider opportunity costs. There are so many things the government wants to spend money on. It can't spend on everything. And every dollar that it spends, say, on the war on terrorism is a dollar that it can't spend on, say, healthcare or education. It had to face trade-offs. It had opportunity costs that had to get factored in as to where is the best place to spend the next dollar. I also want to impart upon you this acronym, TANSTIFL. Now, if I put together a slide, and it's this big slide, and all it has on it is one word or one acronym, you know it's got to be important. If there's one thing that I want you to leave this classroom with, is this, TANSTIFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Everything has an opportunity cost associated with it. Everything has some side effect to it. Everything in the economy is interrelated. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. You tweak something, it's going to cause an impact on something else. My objective is that you take this, you stare at it long enough that it burns an image in your retinas so that when you sleep tonight, what you see and dream will be this TANSTIFL. We make certain assumptions in economics. One is that people want to act rationally. That if someone says, yeah, I like Haagen-Dazs, which I do, that having 2 pints of Haagen-Dazs is better than 1, because I can always take that other one and put it in the freezer for later. I now have choice that I didn't have if I only had 1. And that people act with self-interest. Self-interest does not mean being greedy. Self-interest means that we act in a way that, one, we decide for ourselves what it is that we want. That it isn't the government saying, you have to do this. That, for example, in centrally controlled economies, you're often told, you're going to be a farmer, you're going to be a welder, you're going to be a ballerina, and you don't have a choice. On the other hand, if you're acting in your own self-interest, you get to pursue and make a choice to pursue what it is that interests you. Again, it does not mean being greedy. It means that you are making a decision that you believe is in your short and long-term interest. Emotions are part of this self-interest decision-making. Example, we feel good when we donate to charity. Therefore, donating to charity is acting in our own self-interest. So people act to increase what we call utility. Utility does not mean the company you buy your electricity from. It doesn't mean a certain type of baseball player. It means satisfaction. It means pleasure, happiness. We assume that people act to increase their utility, that people do not act in a way to intentionally do something to reduce their pleasure, to reduce their happiness, to reduce their... No, we all act to increase our utility. Another definition we need to establish is marginal cost, marginal benefit. Marginal means incremental. It means the moving forward costs. In economics, if you're going to make a proper decision, you're going to compare marginal costs and marginal benefits. You're not going to compare total costs and total benefits, because if you do, you will arrive at the wrong decision some of the time. Whereas if you only look at the going forward costs and benefits, you will arrive at the correct decision all the time. So this means that sunk costs, the money that you've already spent, does not get included in your calculation about what to do next. It's a sunk cost. It's water, as they say, over the dam, water under the bridge. It is gone. You can't get it back, and you don't factor it into your calculations. So the economic decision rule here is we look at the going forward benefits, the going forward costs, we compare them. And if the going forward benefits are higher than the going forward costs, we do it. And if the marginal costs are greater than the marginal benefits, we don't do it. Your textbook has a couple pages on sound economic reasoning and the things that can get in the way of people making logical decisions. One is biases. Sometimes we will look at data and ignore some of the data because we have a certain bias that makes us blind to something. And so we need to strip our biases away when we look at data that we then use to make decisions. Loaded terminology is one of my favorites because you pick up something to read And over time, you can train yourself to, that when you see certain words that have emotions attached to the words, and you can see it's something like this horrible inflation rate that we have, this dreaded unemployment rate that we have, that they're using these words that create emotions rather than just simply stating the fact. Whereas if you're stating the fact, you wouldn't say this horrible inflation rate, you would just say the 2% inflation rate. And we're sticking to the numbers. And there are just so many things that get published where they have this loaded terminology, and so many people who aren't in tune to what's going on with the terminology just fall into the trap of reading it, and the brain just absorbs the persuasive message that the author is trying to trick you into believing, rather than you simply looking at the numbers and you evaluating the numbers on your own to arrive at some position as to whether something is too high or too low, or this should be done or that should be done. And so it takes a bit of training to be able to read something and separate out the loaded terminology from what else is being said in either this paper or this speech. We see it so much in politics. Fallacy of composition. How many times have you seen a commercial where, let's say, a movie star will hold, "Hi, I just washed my hair with this shampoo, and look how well it manages itself right now," or "Look at it shine," or "Look how well it feels in my hand right now." Just because it worked for that one person does not mean it's going to work for everybody. And so often we'll see things where they'll say, "Well, we interviewed 5 people, and we came to the conclusion," how about interviewing 10,000 people and having a much broader sample base? Now, can you imagine if we did drug testing on prescription drugs on only a small handful of people, rather than the thousands of people that we do the tests on? Because if you want to have confidence in something, you need to have it done with a broader test base. And so we need to be aware when someone who might have some influence because of their stature, either on Hollywood or wherever, is trying to convince you that they know better for you. Post hoc fallacy. Just because something happened before something else doesn't mean it caused it. I can go outside in the parking lot and I can do a rain dance, and it doesn't mean that it's going to rain. Okay? If we have people who are dancing and it rains, it probably means that you're looking at videotapes of Woodstock back in 1969. Okay? So we need to be careful about, when we see, well, I ate this and then my stomach hurt. Well, is you sure that that's the thing that caused it, or was it something else? There are too many variables here, and just because something happened first and something followed, it doesn't mean that one caused the change. Correlation is not causation. This we see over and over everywhere. One of the ones I see in the press all the time is reports that say there's a high correlation between obesity and diet sodas. What does that mean? Does it mean that the diet sodas cause the obesity? Maybe. But we don't know, because all they gave us was a correlation. They said we tend to see one when we see the other. It has nothing to do with cause and effect. But often these articles are written to make you believe that there's cause and effect. And again, some of the loaded terminology that you'll often see in things that have to do with when there's just a correlation, that the science has not progressed to the causation, that the science is only at this stage with the correlation, they might use some loaded terminology to make you think that there is a causation. We don't know whether the diet soda caused the obesity. It could be the other way around, that the obesity led people to drink diet soda. Again, it could be either way. It just means that they are associated with each other. And then the mistreatment of sunk costs. And we just said on that previous slide, when we do an analysis, we only look at the marginal costs and the marginal benefits. We don't look at the sunk costs. It's not to say that the sunk costs aren't real. It's not to say that you're going to ignore them when you look, say, at a company's total profit and loss statement. But in terms of a decision of what to do going forward, you ignore the sunk costs. So that's part A. Part B is not in your textbook, it's from another textbook. But I wanted to incorporate it because I think they did a great job of taking the big issues in economics and narrowing it down to 10 of them. 1, people face trade-offs. We just talked about opportunity costs, that we're always comparing one objective against another. It could be time, it could be money, it could be the career you decide to go into. It's how do we budget money in our government, like on defense versus consumer. Because again, there are scarce resources, and if we're going to be efficient, and again, in economics, we want to be efficient. And so if we're going to be efficient, the idea is that we want to maximize our scarce resources. We don't want to waste them. Because if we waste them, then we've lost the chance to do something with them, and we don't want to lose that. So we want to be efficient. And so we want to maximize our benefit from scarce resources as we face these trade-offs. The second is that the cost of something is what you had to give up to get it. Again, go back to the previous slide, we face these trade-offs, we make decisions, and so we look at the opportunity cost of what must be given up to get something. You want to get that free slice of pizza? Well, you had to give up 45 minutes standing in line. And so that's what he had to give up to get it. So the cost of that pizza, it wasn't free, it cost him 45 minutes of time. So in our little cartoon here, Einstein discovers that time is actually money. The third thing is that, and we talked about this with our marginal cost, marginal benefit analysis, we only look at the going forward costs and benefits. And so, again, marginal cost, it means the going forward, the incremental. Rational people only consider the marginal cost and marginal benefits. They know that if they look at the sunk costs, they can arrive at the wrong decision. The fourth principle, people respond to incentives. If I am a manufacturer of, say, laundry detergent, and I publish a coupon, not everyone, but there'll be a number of people that will respond to that coupon and purchase that laundry detergent who in the past bought a different laundry detergent. That we know that if you are a buyer and prices go up, you're going to consume less. And if prices come down, you're going to consume more. And if you're a seller, if prices go up, you're going to produce more because, wow, I can get now $200 an acre for my grapes. Last year I only got 100. I want to produce more acres of grapes because the price went up. You want to convert more acreage. Whereas if the price goes down, you're going to cut back on your production. So as a matter of public policy, the government can change your behavior. See, you'll think that you are independent thinkers and that you have free will. And the reality is that the government is changing your behavior all the time. If the government gives you a tax credit for installing solar panels, more of you than before will install solar panels. If the government puts a tax on sugary drinks, fewer people will buy sugary drinks. And so, as a matter of public policy, the government is able to change people's behavior by playing with costs and benefits. Trade is a good thing. Trade makes everyone better off. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about trade among two people here in, excuse me, let's say Martin County or Indian River County. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about trade between two people in Florida or within the United States or globally. It's all the same thing. Okay? We all have those things that we specialize in. And if we focus on the things that we specialize in, we are able to trade at a way for the things that we're not good at, and to then trade with someone who is good at it. And as a result, we are able to have more than we would before because we have arrived at a more efficient situation. We will get into trade later in the course. The concept of markets. A market is not the corner store. A market is not something with bricks and mortar. A market is a hypothetical construct. But we find that markets, this hypothetical construct, where everyone who is producing something and selling this one item, whether it be the market for cell phones or the market for even paper, whatever the market is, all these products, goods and services, each have their own market. And we find that markets, this hypothetical market, where all the buyers and all the sellers are somehow interacting with each other, that this is a really good way to organize economic activity. Just think about all this going on is all done independently, everyone acting in their own self-interest. Very decentralized. And yet we find that, as Adam Smith back in 1776 wrote, when he coined the phrase the invisible hand, it guides us, the hands pushing down, pushing up, and allocating the resources and arriving at prices and quantities that the market is acting on its own, with everyone making their own minds up. And yet we find that it arrives at the most efficient outcome of any arrangement. And so we like when markets are free to allocate resources. Let's contrast this to a centrally planned economy, where it's the government that's making the decisions. The government is saying, we're going to make so many tanks this year, we're going to make so many bushels of wheat this year, and it's the government who's allocating all the scarce resources. And we find it doesn't work very well. That is very inefficient. It does a poor job of adjusting to weather conditions. It does a poor job of adjusting to changes in people's tastes. It does a poor job in really adapting to any change until the next planning cycle comes along. And we saw that centrally planned economies were prone to having shortages of one good and an oversupply of another. In other words, in practice, it's never worked very well. This is not to say that we want government to be out of things totally, because when we have a market that's a competitive market, a truly competitive market, it's best when the government just hands off, let the market do its thing, let it be efficient. But not all markets are truly competitive. We have a number of situations where we have what we call a market failure. And there we need the government to step in. We need the government to set up rules and enforce the rules. We need the government to ensure property rights. We need the government to make sure that the individuals have the ability to exercise control of their property. As we will see in chapter 28, that without certain institutional structures that promote growth, such as property rights, enforcement of the rules, economies don't work very well. We see that the wheels of commerce need a certain lubrication. We see that if there is barriers to being able to conduct business, if we see that there's a lot of risk, then the markets don't behave very well. We need the government to step in and eliminate, if not reduce, those things that are impeding economic growth. We want to have the government step in sometimes to, again, when we have these market failures and the market isn't behaving efficiently, that means it's not allocating the resources efficiently. We need the government to step in and nudge the markets a certain way. We want the government's time to come in and promote equality. Because we see that when we have great disparities in economic well-being, markets don't work very well. We need the government sometimes to, again, correct for these market failures where the market doesn't provide for certain resources such as highways, bridges, self-defense, and so we need the government to step in there. Externalities is another one. Externalities distort a market, whether it be a positive or negative externality. But typically, we think of the negative externalities, where we want the government to come in and, say, impose regulations on, say, secondhand smoke. And then we need the government to make sure that no company gets too much market power, because if they do, then there isn't a competitive marketplace. And so we see that we need, the government has to come in and recognize that there are so many instances where we don't have pure competition, and that we need then to come in and have the government give a nudge to the economy, recognizing that this process is far from perfect. It can actually have inefficiencies to it, and that there are times that we want the government to step in and diminish inequality, even though it introduces some inefficiency to the marketplace. A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce. What is being sold is equal to income. And as we will see when we study the circular flow diagram, what goes in this direction has to, by definition, be equal to what's going in that direction. And so if we want to increase the standard of living, we have to produce more. And so if we're looking at ways to grow the economy, that means that we have to do those things that are going to increase productivity. That's where real growth comes from. Productivity is, I put one unit of input in, crank the handle, what comes out? The more that comes out from, say, the same hour of labor that goes in, if more comes out, therefore it is higher productivity. So higher productivity means higher standard of living. What got us from the Stone Age to where we are now is simply a matter of increased productivity. The growth rate of our country's productivity determines the growth rate of income. 9, inflation comes about primarily because the government printed too much money. You have too much of something, go back to the concept of scarcity. If you have something that was scarce, it's no longer scarce, it now creates lesser value. So if you print money, the value of money falls. That's called inflation. So again, go back to Tanstafel, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. You just can't print money because the inflation happens and then it takes away everyone's purchasing power. You're back to where you were. Then the last principle here is that we face a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We can get unemployment to disappear. But again, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, and the way that we go about it causes inflation. No way around it. I can force the unemployment numbers down and down and down, but it will cause inflation, and therefore the price to get paid is that everyone has to pay more because of inflation to reduce the unemployment. we see that the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment plays a key role in when we start analyzing Keynesian economics within the business cycle. And so we can take those 10 principles and group them into 3 camps. The first one is, how do people make decisions? In other words, how people make trade-offs, how people pay for something in terms of what you give up to get it, how people think at the margin, and how people respond to incentives. These all can be lumped together, how we make decisions. When we talk about how trade makes everyone better off, when we talk about how we organize economic activity into markets, and also how governments can step in and improve those markets, these are about how people are interacting with each other, the buying and selling, the trading. And then these other ones here have to do with how the economy as a whole works. Standard of living, prices, inflation, unemployment, they are all linked together, and so we group them together here. Let's talk part C. We're going to talk about our first economic model in this section. Economists develop models because the models allow us to take a look at something for the purpose of illuminating what it is we're trying to understand. And so they're not complex, because if they were complex, they'd be too difficult to bury through and see the patterns that we're trying to discern. And so we could use some diagrams and equations, and we'll omit some of the minor details, and we're going to make certain assumptions to make things a little simpler, because we do that because we're trying to improve our understanding of what's going on in the economy. In other words, what we're trying to do is to only focus on what's truly important and let the secondary issues get set aside. And so here's a little cartoon. We develop models of the economy. And our first model is what we call the economizing problem. In other words, we have scarcity. We have a limited budget. We have limited income. And we need to pick and choose what combination of goods and services we want to purchase with our income that will maximize our satisfaction, maximize our utility. And so we develop a budget line. This shows all of the combinations of goods and services that we can purchase with that income. And so that budget line depicts the trade-offs and the opportunity costs that are before us. And so, for example, let's say that I have a budget of $120 and I want to decide how to spend it between books and movies. And the cost of a movie is 20 and the cost of a book is 10. And all of these combinations, whether it be 6 movies and no books or 4 movies and 4 books, all add up to $120. And I can plot that on this chart right here. Excuse me. And so here is my budget line. This is showing all of the combination of books and movies. And clearly, anything that's on this side of the blue line, I can afford. It is attainable. I have enough money to pay for it. And anything that's on this side of the budget line is not attainable. I don't have enough money for any combination that resides out here. This concept I can apply to the economy. I can come up with something called a production possibility table. I can take all of the outputs that a country can produce and chart it up the same way. I have my inputs, I got my outputs, okay? This is what I put into the production process. This is the result of the production process. And I plot it up. So for example here, you have 2 tests coming your way. You have a history test and an econ test. You have a certain fixed number of hours that you can spend studying. Unless, of course, you know how to clone yourself. But assuming that you don't know how to clone yourself, you have a fixed number of hours to study. And you can spend it all studying history and ace the test, but because you didn't spend any hours studying economics, you're going to fail. So again, just to further elucidate, the inputs are the number of hours that you studied. The output is the grade. This was the input to the process. That's the output to the process. Or you can study 0 hours for history, not do well, spend it all on economics and do well, and you can see the various combinations in between. I take that data, I put it on a chart, and that's called the production possibility curve. It gives a visual picture of the trade-off. Now, in reality, we know that this is a multi-dimensional thing, but in order to explain the concept, we do it in 2 dimensions. And so I plot up, here's what happens if I study no hours on history and all the hours on economics. Here's if I spend no hours on economics and everything on history and everything in between. What this production possibility curve, or PPC, demonstrates is a very simple model. This is very simple, right? Yet it has a very powerful message that comes out of it. 1, there's a limit to what you can achieve, right? You can't achieve anything out here. You face limits about what you can do. It's the stark reality. The only way to change that, to change the limit of what you can do, is that you got to change your technology. You got to change your resources. You got to change your institutions, like the way laws are and banks are. Unless you make changes here, you are forever limited to what you can achieve. That's powerful. And that every choice you make has a trade-off. Every choice you make has an opportunity cost associated with it. So there's a very simple thing that we just put up here, just trying to show the trade-offs between studying for your tests. Gives us some really powerful basic concepts about our economy, that we have limits. We can't change those limits unless we change certain things, and that everything has a trade-off. So I don't know how many of you remember the movie Animal House. You mean there's a trade-off between sleep and getting an A in economics? Hell yeah. Now, let's give another example here instead of history and economics. Let's say that we have an economy that makes only two products, pizzas and industrial robots. They're pretty different. And this economy can either make no pizzas and take all of its resources to make industrial robots, or it can make no industrial robots and take all of its resources, all of its inputs, and put it into making pizzas, or any combination in between. And we can take this data and we can plot it up on a graph, and we can form our PPC curve, and it would look like this. And again, everything in here is attainable. Everything out here is unattainable. And here's our points A, B, C, and D. The key point here, A and B are on the curve. They are attainable. And it means that we are using all of the inputs. We're using all of the resources that we possibly have at our disposal to produce the pizzas and the industrial robots. Point C is attainable, but what it means is that we didn't use all of our resources. Therefore, we're not being efficient. The point of inefficiency. It's doable, but it means that we left some of the inputs aside and didn't use them. It means people are not working. It means that, say, pizza ovens are not being used. They're there, but they're not being used. And point D is unattainable. With the given inputs that we have, with our given technology that we have, given resources, point D can't get there. Growth gets us there. In other words, finding more inputs, being more productive. These are the things that will shift out the PPC curve. So in this particular case, we have an even shifting out. In other words, we have a technology that affected all the sectors in the economy. So when the personal computer came about, and now all these businesses now rely on personal computers, it made all businesses more efficient. And so everything got shifted out. Whereas over here, we see that whatever the technological change was, it only affected this business and not this business. So for example, if we have our pizzas and our industrial robots, and we have a new type of wheat that we use to make the pizza that is a better crop, hardier crop, and produces more wheat, well, we could increase the number of pizzas that we have in our economy, but it wouldn't do anything for the industrial robots. So let's say we have something that comes along that increases our productivity, or increased our resources, and we now can produce more of the pizzas and the robots. And so we now see that this is where we were before, this is what was attainable before, and now we can attain this. That means this area between the lines, this is what we call growth. The shifting out of the PPC curve is what we mean by economic growth. So when a politician talks about economic growth, what that politician hopefully is talking about is how do we shift out this curve? How do we get more resources as inputs to allow us to have greater output? Now, that curve is sloped. This is talking about how opportunity costs increase the further and further along that we keep making the trade-offs. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, some of our inputs are better suited for making one thing than another. Tom Brady is a very good quarterback, and Rob Gronkowski is a very good receiver. But I don't want to use Gronkowski as a quarterback, and I don't want to use Brady as a receiver. Some resources are better suited for one task than another. And if we're going to be on the PPC curve rather than inside it, we want to use our resources so that they are at their most efficient. But if I want to do something that's going to require, say, 2 quarterbacks, I've got to give up the wide receiver. And so there are trade-offs, and I'm going to lose something in the process. And I've got to give up more and more and more of one thing to get less and less and less of another. And I can just see that physically on the slope, that if I'm here, and I got lots of guns, but at this point I have no butter, I only have to give up this amount of guns, and I get this big increase in butter. On the other hand, down here, I've got to give up lots of guns to now get a small increase in the butter. In other words, the slope of the line changes from being flat to steep. And therefore, the marginal rate of substitution, the trade-offs, get worse and worse and worse the further along this curve I get. So the reason why we have to give up more and more of something to produce more and more of something else is that some things are better at producing one thing than another. And we can introduce this phrase called comparative advantage. If something is better suited to the production of one good than to the other, that means it has a comparative advantage. Tom Brady has a comparative advantage over Rob Gronkowski when it comes to throwing a football. Rob Gronkowski has a comparative advantage over Tom Brady when it comes to catching a football. So this production possibility curve is bowed outward because of this concept of comparative advantage. If we are going to be on the PPC curve, in other words, if we are going to be having our maximum output from our fixed resources, that means we have to trade. We have to trade what we're good at so we can trade that away and get the things that we're not good at. So as it says here, that's really interesting. That's why trade is good. Trade allows us to do what we do best and trade it away for those things that we're not as good at. Example. This is a chart that shows per capita income during the past 2,000 years. Per capita means per person. It's Latin for per head, or per person. And if we take per capita income, we make adjustments for inflation, we see that for much of man's history, income was flat. And then all of a sudden, it takes off like a rocket. What caused this growth? Well, the Industrial Revolution. This is when people started to specialize in the production of certain things. And they began to trade among themselves at a rate much greater than ever before. And that allowed civilization to be much more efficient than ever before. And therefore, we were able to push out that PPC curve, which means we could produce more. And as we said, a nation's income is equal to a nation's production, its output of goods and services. So when you can produce more because you were being more efficient, in other words, you now have the steam engine, you now have tools that you didn't have before that allowed you to farm more acres in a given hour, or you could produce more shoes than you could before in a given hour, incomes go up, productivity increased. Not just productivity for all, but on a per capita basis, everyone's productivity, the per capita productivity increased. So when we want to trade, the more opportunities that we have to make a trade increase our ability to increase our incomes. If we expand our range of trade from, say, eastern Florida to all of Florida to the southeastern part of the U.S. to the full U.S. to it being global, we have more opportunities to trade away those things that we're good at in return for the things that someone else has the comparative advantage for. That increases our income. That increases our standard of living. And we are better off by trading. Yes, globalization gives us access to larger markets, but also those markets now have access to us, and so it increases competition. We find that we have a comparative advantage in innovation. That's what this country is really good at. Technology, discovering new ways of doing things. And then once those new technologies become old technologies, we often move that over into other countries where the wages are low. So again, the benefits of this. 200 years ago, when textile manufacturing in the Industrial Revolution was new, we were good at it. We had the comparative advantage. But now, we export that technology. We now ship to other countries. Oh, for example, Bangladesh is able to use that old technology, which is no longer efficient, but they have the cheap labor. And so it's the combination of the productivity with the cheap labor rate that now gives Bangladesh the advantage. But we are now able to purchase this cloth from them at a lower price, which means that we can now use the lower price cloth in our clothing. We now have money left over because we didn't spend as much for the cloth, or our clothing costs less. We now have more money to spend on other things. We can now spend it on air conditioning. We can spend it on, let's say, instead of having one car could have a really nice car, or instead of having, oh, mashed potatoes, I can now have something a little more upscale like rice-a-roni, or I can spend more because I have saved because of the gains from trade. So my standard of living goes up because I'm able to purchase things at a lower price. Now, we'll also note that due to changes in technology, Bangladesh is losing its advantage here. For example, robotics now allows us to cut fabric using laser cutters quicker, cheaper, more accurately than people can. And so Bangladesh has now lost its comparative advantage, and textile cutting has moved back to this country because it's now a high-tech thing. So I like this cartoon. It's hard to compete in a global economy when you're not allowed to cross the street. This example, and I really like this one, it came up by Professor Lee Bertman here in our economics department, came up with this example, and I've adapted it. I've changed the names here, and let's go through this. It says that Notorious RBG is an attorney. I hope you know who Notorious RBG is. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But let's say she's not on the Supreme Court and she is an attorney with her own practice, and she charges $300 an hour for her services. She would like to expand her business, take on more clients, but she's already working 60 hours a week, and her family doesn't want her to work any more hours. So she can't expand it by doing the work herself. And of the 60 hours, she spent 10 hours in document preparation, and she's really efficient at it. She's been doing it a long time, she's really good at it, and she's able to complete 100 documents in the 10 hours. Right? Or 100 divided by 10 is 10. 10 documents per hour. She has a friend who's an economist, and the economist suggests to her she hire someone. Hire someone to do those 10 hours of document preparation for you. And so the economist has a student, Sonia, and I changed the name here, another Supreme Court Justice, Sonia Sotomayor. And but in this case, Sonia is still a student, and she would like to do the part-time work and would be happy to get paid only $15 an hour to meet Notorious RBG's document preparation needs. And so Notorious interviews Sonia, tests her rate of production, and because she's still a student and not an experienced attorney, she can only do 3 documents an hour. So Notorious looks at this and says, why should I hire this person? I can do 10 an hour. She can only do 3 an hour. And then the economist says, you're missing the point of comparative advantage. It's not a function of just how productive or not productive this person is. It's a combination of the productivity and the cost combined. So let's do the math. We said that the opportunity cost of Notorious doing the documents herself, right? She gets $300 an hour that she could be charging clients per hour. There are 10. So her opportunity cost, when every time she does document, she is foregoing $30 every time she does a document that she could have brought in by doing other legal work. Whereas Sonia is only going to get paid $15 an hour and get 3 documents done, so it's only going to cost her $5 per document. And so if Notorious hired Sonia, she could bill out another 10 hours at $300 and pull in another $3,000 of revenue. But she'd only have to pay Sonia for the $100 times $5 a document, $500. Therefore, even though Sonia can't do the documents as quickly because she's being paid less per hour, Notorious winds up, after bringing in the $3,000 minus paying Sonia $500, an extra $2,500. This is the gains from trade. She traded away something that she was very good at, but clearly Sonia had the comparative advantage here because her wage rate compared with her low productivity was still enough to make it worthwhile for Notorious to go out and bring on more clients and bill them at the $300 per hour. So what should Notorious do? Should she hire Sonia? Oh yeah, absolutely. She's going to make more money even though Sonia can't produce as many documents as quickly. And so how many hours should Sonia work? Well, if she could get 33 hours out of Sonia per week, she would get the full advantage here. So what's the moral of the story? It doesn't matter. It should not matter to Notorious about her superior productivity. In other words, she had an absolute advantage. She was able to do more per hour, so she had an absolute advantage. But what counts is the comparative advantage. So you have to look at the productivity times the cost of the labor. And therefore, the moral of the opportunity is whenever you can trade away because someone else has the comparative advantage on something, you should do it. One more example here. Let's say wages in the US are $15 an hour and in China, $5 an hour. And let's say that we have 3 different ways in which we can manufacture something. In one way, the output per worker is 100, and therefore under option A, at $15 an hour, we churn out 100, the cost per unit is 15 cents. And the output in China, say, is 50. In other words, they don't have an absolute advantage here. The US does. They can produce more per hour. But the wage rate is 3 times less, and therefore the cost per unit in China is 10 cents. And so in option A, it would make sense that we trade with China and import these items from China. If we had the ability to produce 150 per hour, we see that there is no comparative advantage. It's 10 cents for both. And so in scenario B, there is no comparative advantage, and therefore there's no trade. And then there's option C. If